Hey guys, nice to have you back. It's our second video here at the line. I'm actually on holiday this week, which is why I haven't shaved or trimmed my beard. If you're wondering why I'm wearing a 25-year-old Eric Lindros Philadelphia Flyers jersey, it's because it's surprisingly cold today and my kids are being very loud in the house. So I'm doing this outside. And frankly, I needed something warm to wear. Jen Gerson with me as always for these videos, and by as always I mean for our second one. We're talking about what we're going to put in this week's dispatch, and we had a lot of fun doing last week's. We're getting a little more organized with it this week. We have our idea of topics. Normally we haven't been pulling in that much election stuff. Jen's been covering that in her column more so than we have been in our dispatch, but we're changing that up a little bit this week because it was actually, Jen, I mean, it was, if anything, kind of a slow week. I'm looking at my notes here on my phone. It was a slow week in the campaign. There's not a whole hell of a lot that I can add.
Yeah, you and I were talking before we started this video about what the hell I'm going to talk about in our column, and like, there's actually not a lot there. We were fully expecting this to be an exciting week because, of course, the deadline for candidates to be swapped out of the campaign is now shut. So this is usually the week when everybody starts to go full fire, oppo drop at one another. And I was fully expecting the liberals to come at the conservatives hard with a lot of like, these people be cray, they're conspiracy theorists, nutty whatevers. And if anything, I think that the conservatives actually won oppo drop week on points.
I basically agree with that, and I expected a lot more. We might see more as the debates come along. The
Yeah.
parties might try to blow up each other's debate performance by dropping juicy tidbits hours before the debate, so that one of the leaders steps out on the stage and it's just been accused of something terrible or something in his party. But yeah, I expected more, and to the extent that either of the parties was struggling this week to comment on the stuff. Some old comments Aaron O'Toole made about Mariam Monsef came out, and he went, "Yeah, I was frustrated," and my temper ran away from me. Meanwhile, the Liberals are explaining why their zero tolerance policy for sexual harassment seems to include a whole hell of a lot of tolerance for allegations of sexual harassment here. So I think the Conservatives had the better week. I would say this, though, I agree with you, it was not a particularly eventful week on the campaign trail. And there's kind of a theme going on where the Liberals are throwing a lot of punches at Aaron O'Toole, and thus far, I don't think anything's really sticking.
No, not really. They have been attempting to link the protests to the Conservative Party and to the whole, conservative mainstream media, non-mainstream media ecosystem as a whole. And to be honest with you, I just don't think it quite adds up. It doesn't quite work. But let's talk about the dispatch. You said you wanted to lead off with something about the protests.
Well, what I want to do is there's been a lot of talk about we've seen it from the prime minister directly, actually, like, why is not Aaron O'Toole condemning these protesters, right? And I think I understand that a lot of people out there genuinely think these protesters are some adjunct of the conservative campaign. Either that they're outright paid proxies, that they've been sent along to be disruptive, or at least that in the broader sense, the conservatives are responsible for them because of their rhetoric or their commentary or things like that. I don't buy it. And you and I have actually spoken about this. The conservatives have a lot to apologize for and a lot to own up for. They have done nudge, nudge, wink, wink with far right elements.
Agenda 21,
Yeah.
Great Reset, blah, 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 blah.
And there are members of the conservative movement, including some probably in the caucus, who are batshit, and the party should have denied. And I don't deny any of that, but I look at these protesters and I don't buy a direct link to the conservatives for two reasons. First of all, this is not helping the conservative campaign. We'll talk about this. I think you're going to talk about it a bit in your column. If anything, this is good news for the liberals.
Oh,
Purely
hugely.
from a strategy perspective, this is not the conservatives doing this. Also, I tend to think this is kind of one of those life lessons, right? People always assume ill intent when you can normally assume incompetence. I don't think the conservatives have created this. I think they've ignored it, and now they're in danger of being gobbled up by it. Like, if we look
Yeah.
at what has happened in the American conservative movement, they're still very smart, intellectual American conservatives, and they have been completely displaced by the freak show of the American right wing right now. Canada's not quite there yet, but normally we're only a few years downstream of the Americans, right? I think American conservatives at a very high level probably cannot believe what has happened to their movement, but now they've got to ride that dragon. Like,
Yeah.
they don't have anything else they can do. Canadian Conservatives probably still have enough time to bend the trajectory on this, but they don't have a lot of time to waste. When I'm looking at these protesters, I'm not looking at something the Conservatives created per se, because it's popped up all over the world.
Yeah.
I'm looking at something they ignored, were surprised by, didn't know
Or
how
thought they could kind of tap, sort of, and then
yeah,
control. Like, I mean, I remember having conversations with Preston Manning, and talking about populism in Alberta, and his whole philosophy was like, look, populism is like an oil well, an oil geyser. You kind
yeah,
of have to tap it, but you can't tap it too deep or it's going to blow up on you, and you can't tap it too thinly or essentially it's going to backfire on you. So like you have to tap it in just the right way and channel that energy
yeah.
into mainstream electoral reform and movements, and then you can control it. And I think that we're starting to realize that no, you are going to get eaten by the dragon you ride in on here. The other interesting thing that's come out is reporting on how these guys are actually, firstly, what they believe in, and it's a very hodgepodge of weird
Weird
beliefs,
stuff.
and also how they organize themselves. And they're organizing themselves through like private telegraph and WhatsApps and things like that. Like it's not a mainstream top down organized effort. It is very much a bottom up populist sort of spontaneous a gathering kind of effort that is hugely reflective of what's happening in global populist currents.
Yeah, and I think people, particularly who are not conservative voters, assume that there is a degree of conservative complicity or control over this movement, where I think the better way of understanding is that the Conservatives, those that are paying attention, are scared shitless of this, because they see that this could easily eat them alive, and then we're going to end up with the kind of insanity we've seen south of the border. So I want to write about that a bit. One of the issues that came up this week, and it percolated a lot in Ontario, my home province, because the Doug Ford government, as totally and obviously predictably was inevitably going to happen, has buckled on a vaccine passport. A classic Doug Ford reversal. I wrote a column about that earlier in this week elsewhere. No, I won't. No, I won't. No, I won't. No, I won't. Fuck it. I'll do it. And now that he's done it, of course, there's also talk about a federal version. There'll apparently be separate documents for travel. You had a takeaway from this, which is, we can talk about the policy and the effectiveness and all that stuff, but we shouldn't ignore the fact that we're basically talking about fantasy land right now, because we're an incompetent country, and it will take months for us to do this.
Yeah. This is what a vaccine certificate is going to look like in Alberta. It's going to look exactly like our this is my personal healthcare card. Like, it's going to look like a tiny little stupid like paper document that's going to disintegrate in your wallet in 3 months, and it's going to be typed out on like by Norma down at the Alberta Health Service office on a typewriter. Like, that's if you're lucky. That's the provincial stuff. So I mean, Justin Blaine's actually done some really good work about sort of the background stuff about what's going into the vaccine passport. And yes, we're a third world country that can't get anything done. So of course it's going to be months and months and months before we even have anything resembling a federal travel document. The provinces can probably move a little bit faster with maybe like a little paper document of some kind, but it'll basically be a version of what you got when you got the shot, and it will be easy as hell to fake. So we're all kind of fighting around the edges of this. I have some questions as to how effective a lot of these mandates and passports are actually going to be at curbing spread of what is essentially going to be an endemic virus, and we have to come to terms with that. That's a broader philosophical point. The practical point is that actually getting the cards into hands is it's not going to happen anytime soon anyway. So everybody needs to kind of cool their heels a little bit.
Well, I mean, brought to you by the country that couldn't figure out an automated payroll system. It's an international travel document, right? Like,
what happened to our contact tracing apps? Like, I mean, this is not, and to some extent, I almost have a paradoxical appreciation for the incompetence of our country, because I think it does more to secure our respective individual freedoms than anything else, right? Like, we can't get our shit together on any of this. We haven't been able to get our shit together for 2 freaking years. Like, we should have been talking about vaccine passports and mandates and certificates and all this sort of stuff a year and a half ago. Like we couldn't see that far ahead, and so now we're having this conversation way late in the game. So it's I think that everybody needs to calm down a little bit on this stuff, because I mean, just the practical challenges of getting something like this up and running and functional. I mean, Ling said December at the earliest.
Yeah.
That means spring. That means late spring of 2022. Who knows what our situation in COVID will even be by that point, honestly.
Well, it brings to mind, and I mean, here I was already knocking the provincial government a bit, but it brings to mind a little bit hotel quarantine and border control
Yeah.
from the feds, which is
Yeah.
ignore it, ignore it, ignore it, ignore it, ignore it. Oops, our polls are moving in the wrong direction. Throw something together that is ineffective and in some ways actually actively bad, and then cancel it. And then just like, so we could end up, I mean, the one thing I think will be different, there are two external forces here that I think will force us to do something, even though we'll do it late, slow, over budget, and incompetently. I wrote a column about this already. What's going to force our hand on vaccine certificates or whatever for domestic purposes is going to be insurance. It's going to be business insurance, basically saying, we need to see your restaurant, your concert venue, your retail store. We need to know what your pandemic management plan is. And that's going to have to include some way of verifying the status of customers. That's not going to be a government directive. It's going to be basically the insurers are going to find a way to offset their risk for lawsuits and stuff. And what will force our hand federally is going to be the
International travel standards.
So I think we will figure out something here, but it will be ugly and late and probably over budget. Speaking of budgets and stuff, you and I are not economists, but there were bad economic numbers this week, and
very bad.
They weren't what we were expecting. They were worse than what we were expecting. And it came up in a conversation you and I were having about your column, which by the time the viewers see this will already be published, talking about campaign platforms, costed promises, things like that. I was telling you about an Ontario election I covered years ago, and I wish I could find the damn column. I've been Googling for it, but I can't find the damn thing. What it was in Ontario, we were having a provincial election, and there was some report coming out. I don't remember if it was the Drummond report or an Auditor General report, but there was something coming out where we understood that the economic numbers were worse than we had expected, but that the report wasn't going to be out yet in time for the budget and the election. So all of these parties were making fully costed promises of what they were going to do with spending and revenue and programs, but it was existing in like kind of like an almost universally acknowledged fantasy world where everyone's baseline assumptions were wrong. We just didn't know how wrong they were yet officially. And I think we're kind of looking at a little bit of the same thing here, whether it's the Conservative plan, the NDP plan, or the Liberal plan. What the hell who are we kidding here? Like, we don't know what our economic recovery is going to look like yet.
No, I call it budget nihilism because I'm like, LOL, nothing matters. People are throwing around monopoly money ideas at this point. I mean, you got Jagmeet Singh throwing around $5,000 per renter as if that's not going to be a giant transfer of government wealth to like landlords and MasterCard, just as it was when we had Ralph Bucks here in Alberta. I don't think the Conservatives necessarily have a particularly stringent policy or plan. They have like the outline of a plan. I mean, I think Bloomberg wrote something about how the Liberal platform had $40 billion of spending promises. Look, we have no idea what our financial capacity is going to be in the next 6 months. We just don't. It's possible that we could have some kind of breakaway financial recovery, in which case we will have more room and fiscal capacity to continue to that virtuous circle of spending. Or it's possible that everything just totally tanks and the government is left going shruggy face. Like, there's not much more we can actually do. I mean, I think 2 years ago, the PBO basically put out a report and said, look, we can't continue spending through the pandemic, like giving people CREB at the rate that we are currently giving them. We are going to run out of fiscal capacity. And I mean, what has been sort of underreported is the fact that the Bank of Canada is essentially buying up our bonds, which means we're printing money. And we're just kind of hoping that that's going to be fine and not lead to any kind of inflationary effects. And then, 2 days ago comes out that our overall financial situation is not good. The economy is starting to shrink, and we're starting to see things like words like increased sale or increased prices and volumes, or you know what I mean? Like, okay, so all this inflation that you guys have been telling us not to worry about because we were in a recessionary space is maybe something we kind of should be worrying about. Who knows, right? Like, who knows? We just don't know. Nobody knows. So all of the promises that are being made on the financial front by all of these parties is back of napkin fantasy math at this point.
And it's such a missed opportunity here, because what we should have had was an election where we acknowledge the fact that things are going to be different going on here. Like we have spent our way through a ton of our fiscal cushion, and the operating political assumption for Canadian federal politics for 20-25 years has been we have fiscal capacity at the federal level. So spending a lot on this thing or running a high deficit for a short period of time was sustainable. We still have some capacity left. We haven't zeroed it out, but we have taken a big bite of it. And the thing that bothers me, I used to talk with this about the big economic brains who used to tell me even years ago, don't worry, Matt, like we have fiscal capacity. And I would say to them, yeah, but having a fiscal capacity is like having emergency savings or having like 2 weeks of food and water in your basement. It's
like having a lot of space on your credit card.
Yeah, like it's there for when you need it. And we were using it because it was convenient to use, not because it was necessary to use. And we are not promised a smooth, uneventful recovery. This is like, we could be, I don't say this to be a bummer, but God only knows when the next COVID's coming. I'm not even talking about future waves. Like coronaviruses mutate on us kind of randomly. We don't know when the next international emergency will be, when the next natural disaster will be. And we have spent a huge percentage of our emergency cushion already.
Yeah, so this is the real question, is that have we maxed out our fiscal capacity? No, but we can't take another COVID. We couldn't do that again, right? Are we so sure that there isn't going to be another major emergency coming? Why would we be sure of that? Like, this is where we get into real shaky territory financially. So like, yes, we're playing with monopoly money, we're playing with hypothetical math. You're right. I mean, I wish that the parties had talked more about, look, this is the scenarios that we could be hitting into. It could be good, it could be dark, it could be bad. This is sort of my overall sort of philosophy to dealing with what I think the future is going to bring for us. And nobody's really having that conversation. Nobody really dares, because it's grim. On that note, so
what the Ontario thing was years ago, right? Where all these parties knew the numbers were going to be way worse than what they were pretending. But on election trail, for election campaign, they wanted to be the optimists. I want to say, we're going to do this, or we're going to do that. We're not going to tax you. And they just ignored the fact that we knew the numbers were going to be bad. You were looking at COVID modeling. You've written about this before, but this is still on your mind.
Oh man, do I ever love writing about COVID modeling. So I get this text from my very good friend in Ontario, whom I adore. And she sends me this text out of the blue, and it's the Ontario Science Table's latest COVID modeling. And she said to me, do you have any idea what would happen if I walked into a meeting with a range from 500 to 9,000 and expected people to take me seriously? My God, I want to believe you, scientists, but you are making it impossible to have any faith in your work. She's spot on. Okay, couple of problems here. One, once again, we have modeling that is basically unfalsifiable. They're predicting everything from things continue to get better to off the charts disaster. That range is so high that essentially they can't possibly be wrong, right? So they've created a predictive table that is not falsifiable. A predictive table that is not falsifiable has no value as a predictive table, okay? None, because you can't make plans, you can't do anything with that. Secondly, it has no value as an element of communications, as a communication strategy. All you're doing is potentially scaring the shit out of people who are sending their kids back to school when this entire table screams, we have no idea what's going to happen, right? And this kind of gets to me to the deeper problem with the way our communication strategy is going and has gone in the last couple of months. We're 18 months into this thing, and we're still fear, harder, fear, at a moment when the disease is endemic, it's not going away, and everyone is going to get exposed to it. So you're scaring the shit out of people when the reality is that there's not much more we can do.
There isn't much more we can do. We can, and I'm sure we'll eventually boost the population with more vaccines, either to adapt to new variants or to increase immunity.
Eventually we hit herd immunity. Whether or not that happens in 1 year or 10 years depends on the variants. It is not knowable at this point, but this is just a risk that we all now have to live with and get on with our lives. So given that understanding, what is the value of the Ontario Science Table publishing completely unfalsifiable predictive models?
I
I don't, there's none. There's no value in that.
I have enormous respect for the work they've been doing in a guidance capacity, like guiding, like suggesting what we should do to deal with these problems. A model with a range of 500 cases a day to 9,000 cases a day is not meaningfully useful. It's useful for the government to be able to see where we're tracking on kind of the expected scenarios. Are we worst case scenario? Are we best case scenario? Somewhere in between. But no, I agree with you. And in the big picture sense, we're just going to have to get used to this thing. We can eventually boost the population with more vaccines, and we can probably, to some extent, nudge vaccine compliance up a little bit. But that's about all we have left to do. Other than that, we're stuck with COVID for a long, long time.
Well,
and we learn to live with the flu, and we'll have to learn to live with COVID. And that sucks, but it's just the way it is.
well, and this is where we get into sort of deeper conversations about vaccine mandates and vaccine passports and all of this kind of stuff. I mean, the question is, to what extent can we meaningfully increase the vaccination rate or meaningfully decrease the spread with these kinds of measures? And my suspicion is that at this point, we're futzing at the edges. I think that we are. I think the only thing that's demonstrated over time to have real impacts on COVID spread are dramatic and draconian border lockdowns and dramatic and draconian border restrictions and dramatic and draconian border lockdowns, none of which we were able to pull off at the height of the spread of this disease when we were not vaccinated. So the concern that I have is that, look, if you kind of cave on these sorts of things at this spread, at the peak of Delta, you're kind of locking yourself into the cycle that never ends, because there's going to be another variant after this, and there's going to be another variant after that, there's going to be another variant after that. And this is going to go on maybe for another 6 months, and maybe for another 6 years, and maybe for another 60 years. That is unknowable at this point. That's the nature of an endemic disease. So we have to find ways to deal with that risk in a sustainable, measured way. And I don't see the value, and I don't see us getting to that sustainable, measured way by consistently scaring the fuck out of people. I just don't think that that gets us there.
No, especially because the people who have already been responsible have gotten vaccinated, and those who aren't are not going to be scared into getting vaccinated by a science table prediction with error bars that cover every possible.
I know that, but I mean, like the science table predictions that have been wrong, right? I mean, that's the problem, is that, you know, a couple of months ago, I kind of did a cagey column where I'm like, I don't think that we're going to have a fourth wave, and I don't think we're going to have a fourth wave. I'm not a mathematical expert. I just don't think we're going to have a fourth wave based on what I see happening in the UK. It does seem like the vaccines are working. I was wrong. We had a fourth wave. I admitted it. I put in a column, and like, it's just like, there you go. So you can come after me and be like, you were wrong. But you know what? I'm not like credentialed. I'm not pretending to be credentialed. I don't have doctors behind my name. I'm not wearing a white coat. I'm not advising the government on their science table. I'm just a journalist hack who's telling you what I think is going on based on the same kind of limited data that everybody else got. And I own that. I can own that euphemistic humility. And I can just be like, I can't know for sure, but this is what I think. Yeah. I don't have the kind of credibility that someone who's on something called the Ontario Science Table has. And so therefore my responsibilities to the public are fundamentally different. And at the same time, you know, when these guys get this shit wrong, nobody is holding them to account. There's almost the journalists aren't calling them to the mat being like, well, your last 3 models were out to fucking lunch. And that's the thing that I find frustrating about all of this. It's using scientific credentialism and expert and appeal to authority and expertise to make these predictions that nobody then holds them to account, that are not falsifiable, and then nobody holds them to account when they don't pan out. And I think that's a failure on as our duty as journalists to point out that when the emperors don't have any clothes.
We had fan mail come into our line editor account, and it was a request from a member of the public that we cover a story. And I said, mostly politely, that I didn't think it was a story worth covering. And it wasn't that it's not valuable or important or interesting. It's just like there's a whole hell of a lot else happening right now, and we are a small operation. But it's a story with a strong Western Canadian component. So I promised our reader I would put it to you. What do you think of John Carpe and the JCC?
Oh, the JCCF. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Justice
So
Center
this
for
is,
Constitutional Freedom, I think, because
yeah.
he got kind of put on leave from there a few months ago because there's a judge who is involved in a case, the JCCF, which is sort of an activist group that will launch litigation on issues of personal or civil liberties, right? Which is good. I think that's
And
fine.
it's also got a strong social conservative bent.
Oh yeah, yeah, no,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
so, and so there's a case where a judge is reviewing one of these matters, and John Carpe, who's the president of the JCCF, had put a private eye trailing the judge, and Carpe had said
See if he violated COVID restrictions.
that's what he said. He said it was unrelated to the case that the judge was overseeing. Maybe it was fanatically stupid. It was just an incredibly stupid thing to do. So apparently some of the board members have now quit the JCCF. Carpe was suspended for a bit and he's back. And our reader was saying that we should be covering this more because we need to be paying more attention to liberty protecting institutions in Canada. To be honest, I was interested kind of because I thought the meltdown was interesting. Like it only entertained me as a train wreck. I just didn't. And I told our reader, in the middle of a federal election, in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of the debacle in Afghanistan, I didn't see the JCCF story as particularly urgent for us. But I said in good faith, I would bring it up to you. And do you think this is something we need to care about?
Kind of. So yeah, I mean, I think in Canada we don't have a lot of organizations that are willing to play devil's advocate against the sort of mushy center left consensus that exists in this country. And I think that Canada is poorly served by that. I think that it's useful to have organizations like the equivalent of what the ACLU used to be, or like the JCCF, who can say like, no, I am going to argue for the right of student groups to put graphic pictures of dead fetuses on campus. Like, like that is a fundamental classical liberal function. And bluntly, not very many organizations will take that stuff on here because it's not done. You know what I mean? Like, it's just kind of not Canadian. And like I said, I think our civil society suffers as a result of that lack of the kind of third party civil function stuff. So the JCCF, I mean, it's a question of how important you think the JCCF is. The JCCF has a tendency to blur the line between judicial activism that is sane and then like stunt judicial activism. You know what I mean? The stuff that's just, okay, you're not a serious organization if you're doing stuff like that. And this trailing the judge was a classic example of that. It's really hard to know whether or not to take them seriously. They are often the guys who are going to take on the cases of last resort that might have significant social value. But how much of what they're doing is legitimate activism and how much of it is just like trolling the libs? I think in recent years, it's become harder and harder to gauge the principles of the organization, understand the mushiness of that. So yeah, I think it might be worth looking into and writing about, probably after the election.
Yeah.
I don't think that is an urgent thing, but I do think that it's worth examining. We could use in this country a JCCF that is actually a serious organization that takes itself and its principles seriously.
I don't pay as much attention to it as you obviously do. I spent years though as an editor at the National Post, and we would routinely get op-eds from them. So they've certainly been on my radar for a long time, and I know who they are. I don't want to get any details here. I don't want to talk about any of the personalities involved, but something you just said, I was off camera, but I was nodding when you said it. There has been a drift where not long ago I would have looked at them and thought, okay, sometimes a little bit out there, but doing good, honest, sincere work. In recent years, I've been looking at them and I'm going, really? Like there has been sort of a trollification of it. And that was my perspective from a considerable remove. All right, so we'll file that under, we'll write about it eventually, but we won't rush into it now. And I think that concludes our video for this week. So everybody, thank you. That was our second video. Continue to enjoy, continue to subscribe, share if you liked it, and we'll see you again in a week. Take care.